Well, another Monday morning is here, and I got a few little short stories for you. I'm trying to make these videos where they're not quite so long because I know you guys are sort of busy and you need to get back to work or you need to get ready and get to work. So I'm just going to jump into some of these tips and observations. Number 29, I just gave that number randomly. I've done so many of these I hadn't counted them. Figured I'd start numbering them at a random spot. This was a 2012 GMC. There's a couple of things going on with this truck. To begin with, you can tell there's an issue with the PCV because the PCV valve on this one is just a little orifice built into the valve cover. And typically, it's a good idea to go ahead and replace the valve cover if you find a situation like this, although there are some alternatives. But the long and the short of it is the PCV is delivered, the vacuum is delivered to the crankcase through a little orifice that's built into this, and there's a baffle there so it doesn't pull oil out and all that. Well, this one here, if you'll notice, has oil puddled up in there. And if you disconnect this from the valve cover and there's oil puddled up in there, you got issues with that. Some of the GM vehicles had this little tiny orifice here in what looked like a regular PCV valve until you pull it out and look at it. So somebody had decided, well, we really don't need this little metering thing with this spring in here. We can just put a little orifice in there. Some of the Asian vehicles figured this out long years ago, back in the 70s. I used to see some of them that just have a little vacuum line connected to a little nipple on the valve cover. This right here is from a 4-liter Jeep Cherokee, and it's a little orifice. That's your PCV right there. But this particular truck, in addition to this, was having issues with being over full on oil. And what this guy was doing was, as soon as he parked his truck, he pulled the dipstick. He would notice it was showing a quart low, and he'd add a quart. And on this particular, this 5.3 engine that he had in there, some year models of this, I really don't know if all the 5.3s were like this, but that particular one, that 2012, it would take the oil, even with a hot engine, a while to get it work its way back down into the pan so you'd get an accurate reading with your dipstick. The problem this guy had was whenever he would pull the dipstick, he would actually see low oil when the oil wasn't low. If he waited an hour and went back and pulled the dipstick without adding any oil, he would have seen a full crankcase. And so people wind up with too much oil in their crankcase if they check the oil like that. So that's something that he was having with that one. Anyway, this is the changing world of PCV. PCV system basically is this is a plenum where there's vacuum, see behind the throttle plate. You're applying vacuum to the crankcase. You're pulling these blow-by gases out of the crankcase, and you're pulling them into the closure hose, and then that basically cycles them through the engine, and then they burn. That's the thing. It's drawn, and there's steam. That steam from this PCV system is what turns it. It basically settles in here after you shut the engine off. There's a lot of oil steam floating around in here, and that's what likes to coat the inside of the intake and the back of the throttle plate and all that kind of stuff. And some of the later models, they would put some coating on the throttle plate to keep it from being so bad to do that, but it still typically would always, start to clog it up. Then your adaptive learning for your idle would have to kick in and provide more air because of the clogging and all that kind of stuff. But that was a little diagram that I built for that. This right here was an interesting situation that we had. I mentioned it a time or two before, I think, with a 98 F-150 that we put an engine in. We got it from LKQ. And so I made these people a price and ordered the engine from LKQ. And you might know there's the Romeo and the Windsor versions of this engine. And they're not exactly the same, although just looking at them you can't tell. So if you look at the 8th digit on a Romeo engine, it's W. If you look at the 8th digit, VIN digit on a Windsor engine, it's 6. I don't know why they didn't put W for Windsor and 6 for Romeo, or R, but they put 6 for Windsor and W for Romeo. Anyway, this is not because of the two, the Windsor versus Romeo, because I asked the guy at LKQ, why does my replacement engine have 8 flywheel bolts and my original engine only had 6? And he says, well, there's no rhyme or reason to that. Obviously the crankshaft came from a different vendor or something back when it was built, But he says, it doesn't matter if it's Windsor or Romeo. That's what the LKQ guy said. You may run into this. So I had to up the ante on this and sell these people a flywheel. And so I had to get I had a 6-bolt flywheel, which was not going to work on this 8-bolt, crankshaft. And so I says, I may have said crankcase earlier, I meant to say crankshaft. But anyway, so got him an 8-bolt flywheel. That was another $100 that we didn't expect to have to spend. But anyway, whenever we got it, there it was. You may run into this or you may not. I don't know, but I ran into it. This right here is the Motorvac Transtec transmission flush machine that I was talking about. And what you would do is that you'd pour oil in here more than what was required to do the transmission. You're going to hook the hoses up. There's a bunch of adapters in a tray on the back of this thing. Hook it up between the cooler and the transmission, in other words. But there was this, first you had to put this loop out thing in between the cooler and the transmission. They had clear hose, and you would start the engine and see which way the oil was flowing. That way you would know which, the clean oil hose had to be hooked to the side that was going in to the, it's going to leave going into the transmission. The dirty oil hose had to be hooked so that what was coming from the transmission would go into the dirty oil tank. And then when you got through with this, you weren't supposed to leave the oil in this thing all night long, or it would mess up the pressure sensors in the machine and all. So it had to be emptied immediately as soon as you got through the transmission. And you didn't need to leave a bunch of oil in here either, or at the very least you could loosen the cap. But the long and the short of it is, pour a bunch of clean oil in here. You could see this going down and this coming up, and then you'd have all the clean oil in there, and then we'd go ahead and do a regular transmission service after that to change the filter and put 5 more quarts in there and all that. It takes a lot of fluid to do this. That's the way we did it. Sometimes you'd have to hold the engine up in this pressure gauge here. You got to have about 35 pounds of pressure for this to work right. Got to hold the engine speed up to about 1500 RPM on some of them to keep that pressure up, or this machine will stop. If there's no pressure, it'll go beep, 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 and it'll stop working. Hold the engine speed up, pressure up, and let it empty this tank and fill that one up. Clean oil out, dirty oil in. I told one student that seemed pretty intelligent, and he worked on a chicken farm, and I says, when you're through, you would take the dirty oil hose, and what you would do is you'd put it in your waste oil tank, and you'd hit empty waste, and then it would pump that out. And I told this guy in no uncertain terms, I says, don't ever put that dirty oil hose into this clean oil tank. Always put it in the waste oil tank, which is that big thing we got over in the corner. And he looks at me and he nods his head. And so I'm watching him, and as soon as he gets through, he takes the dirty oil hose, puts it in the clean oil tank, and he's going to hit empty waste. And I said, stop. What are you doing? Did I not tell you that? Oh, and he acted so confused. This same guy, I had a big old battery on a tan truck. The hand truck was metal. And I took I told him before, when I was just first getting this thing set up, I said, what you need to do is do not take these jumper cable clamps and hook them to this metal crossbar on this. And this guy worked on a farm, you'd felt like he'd have known better. And I says, don't put him on this metal crossbar between these 2 handles up here at the top or it'll short out. He nods his head the same way. And as soon as I'm watching him, and he takes these 2 and he puts them on the metal, just like he said, he nodded his head when I told him not to do. Well, I used some radiator hose clamps to put a piece of wood across there to put the clamps on, to put the jumper cable clips on that were connected to the battery. Anyway, I sort of got off on a tangent there, but sometimes you'll sell something to somebody and they're looking straight at you, they're nodding their head, and you think they heard you. I've actually had customers like that. I would ask them a question. No, they would ask me a question, and then I would tell them the answer in detail, and they would nod their head, and then ask me the same question again, like they hadn't even heard anything I said. This was an interesting thing here. You got a pass on this refrigerant identifier, even though it was 38% air. What do you think about that? Now, technically, the air that was in there does not contaminate the refrigerant. You can get that air out of there. As a matter of fact, you can you can go ahead and pump this out into your machine, and then you can clear the air out of your machine. Of course, you got to know how to do that. But this one here, it gave us a green light in the past, even though it was 38% air. Somebody charged this one up without pulling the air out first. One of my students, he had a Ford Ranger, and he changed out at home. He changed out his accumulator, and then he just charged it up with refrigerant without pulling the air out of it. Now, what my dad used to do, and this was kind of funny, he understood this, but he didn't. He had a shop, but he didn't work on air conditioners hardly ever. And he was working on my mother's diesel Buick, and this a long time ago. It was an 80 model Buick diesel, and he knew he needed to get the air out of that system before he charged it up. So he built him a hose, and he hooked it up. Let's see, no, it wasn't a diesel Buick. It was a gas burner. It wasn't a diesel. I'm sorry, that was wrong. Of course, she had a diesel Buick, but this was a different vehicle. But one way or another, he hooked this up to the charge port. This was one of those R12 systems. And then the other end of this thing, he hooked it to the manifold. And he just let engine vacuum, which you only got about 18 inches of engine vacuum, even when the engine's running out of 18 to 22 inches. He let that run for a while, and then he screwed it off the Schrader valve, and he had evacuated his system. Then he charged it up, and it worked just fine. I don't know if he got all the air out of there or not, but I told my son about that, and he actually charged up his wife's car the same way, and she got some cold air. But if you got too much air in there, though, you wind up with an air compressor, and your high side pressure to go out of sight, because air will not condense into liquid, you see. And that's one of the reasons you need to get all that air out of there. Too much air in there, you're going to wind up with a 400 or 500 pounds of head pressure before you can stop, because the air conditioner compressor, it actually makes a pretty good air compressor. On a pickup truck that I had, a Ford pickup one time, I mounted another air conditioner compressor, one of them old piston types that they used to make, and I hooked a refrigerant tank up under the hood, and I could turn on the clutch on that extra compressor I had on there and pressure up that tank with air. I just did this for the fun of it one time. And I had a air hose rolled up under there with a thing to air up tires, and I thought, this is stupid. I don't even know why I'm putting this in there. I'll never use this. And it astonished me after I put that extra air conditioner compressor on there, pumping air into that tank. I didn't have a regulator. I just turned it on with a switch, a little lever switch out there under the hood. Turn it on, let it run for a little bit. I'd have air going into that refrigerant tank that I had, bungeed down under the hood. And I could use that to air up people's tires and air up my own tires. It boggled my mind how many times I used that. I couldn't believe it. Anyway, an air conditioner compressor, if you want to build you a little air compressor, works pretty good, Now this right here, I want you to watch this. This is an interesting situation here. This right here, this is the way GM and some of your Fords wire up their fans so that whenever you got your low speed cooling fan, you energize this relay, right? So you energize that relay. Okay, what happens? So this clicks over, and the power goes through this fan, and it goes through this normally closed contact, and then it goes through this fan to ground. So you got your fans running parallel. I'm sorry, in series, not parallel. You got them in series, they're running at half speed, 6 volts per fan, more or less. And I built this board right here so that my students would have to wire that up. It's got 3 relays, got 2 switches, and we got battery power connected to it and all that. Well, with this one clicked on, if you turn on that one, the half relay control, you're energizing this relay, all of a sudden, bam, this closes and you've got a direct ground to that one. It's running full speed. Also, this one closes and you've got direct power going to this one that runs full speed. That's not complicated. And that's one of the reasons I would give them this schematic, and I'd have them wire the fan up, and then I'd have them demonstrate to me they'd wire it up right. This switch right here, whenever they would turn on that toggle switch, they'd run at half speed. Whenever you push that button, they'd kick on high and run at full speed. Now that was the way they're wired up on a lot of them. Hyundai came up with some wacky module to make this work, and I don't know why in the world they did that. Simpler is better, typically. Well, Toyota gave you this schematic. Now, see how easy this schematic is to understand? Of course, granted, I had simplified it somewhat, but it's accurate. This is not only a complicated schematic that's hard to read. There's one fan motor. There's the other fan motor. And you can kind of see they were trying to do the same thing here, There's a problem here, though, with this schematic, with this Toyota schematic. Now, I don't know if all the Toyota schematics about these fans are like this, but watch what happens when I play this. All right, it's going to pop that fuse if it's wired up the way they got it. And here's why. Look at this. Power is going through here, coming down here. What is this? This is ground. That makes no sense whatsoever. So you're running power and ground together right here. See? I mean, I've traced that out. I thought, this is the wackiest, stupid thing I've seen. You know, and if somebody's trying to trace out the current path, they're going to be dreadfully confused when they get to this, because it's going to pop the fuse. That's not the way it's wired up, obviously. But they were doing the same thing here that this schematic is doing, only, like I say, it was kind of hard. It was harder to read. And one of the things I found out about Toyotas a long time ago was you could take something like a Ford Escort and a Toyota Corolla of the same year model, and the Toyota's wiring was a whole lot more complicated than what you were doing on the Escort to do basically the same job. So, this is another look at that. This is what you're going to see when you go to the schematic on that one. But this right, these relays, these fan controls on the vehicle are actually coming from the PCM or somewhere like that. There's other different ways that this is done. But this one right here was the most interesting, and I built that board to demonstrate that, and it worked really, really well for. And the students, I had one student, I had some holes, and I don't even know why I felt the need to do that, but I had some holes drilled with a hole saw back here so these fans could get air, and I thought, why do the fans even need air? They could spin without that. But you know, you're not thinking when you're first doing that. So behind the board, behind this fan, there was a hole. And one student got so good at this to where he could wire it up in about 2.5 minutes without a schematic. I mean, he wasn't good at anything else he did in the shop or anywhere else, but he was really good at wiring up his board. It resonated with him. And he laid his hand up here on the top while that fan was spinning and managed to stick his finger in through one of them holes, and it took his fingernail off. But what I was doing after that was I got some netting, some screen, and put back there where people couldn't put their finger in there. Boggled my mind that, you know, that guy did that, laid his hand up there and just let it stick in that hole. That was my fault for even drilling those holes in there to start with. You know, the holes are like, you know, same size hole you'd have if you were going to put a gauge in the dash or something. This is a duct tape thing here. Some of these people are really, really good with their tape. I saw another one that the other day, and I couldn't find it, or I was going to put it on here. Somebody did an entire smooth looking paint job on their car with nothing but duct tape. The entire car was covered with lines of duct tape that was so perfectly put on there you'd think it was done at the factory. But whenever you are trying to get by, the best way you know how, you use duct tape and plastic and stuff like that. You know, if somebody's busted out the back glass, you can't afford to pay $1,000 for a back glass, then you get some plastic and duct tape and you do what you have to so you can keep driving the vehicle. Everybody's got places they need to go, and they got to get groceries and all this kind of stuff. I'm not making fun of these people, because I've been in a situation where I actually, one of my Volkswagen Rabbits, I cut a piece of plexiglass to fit the little vent window. That was back when they had the little triangular vent windows, and it seemed like it got broke out or something. I can't remember. Well, I just cut a piece of plexiglass that fit in there perfectly, and I siliconed that in there. You know, so you do whatever you have to do. I don't know exactly what was going on here, unless only part of the window was broke out. I'm still trying to parse that. I saw that. And then you got this guy here, 3 humans trying to unlock a car to get keys out. There's plastic taped over the back window, and they could have just peeled that off and reached in there and unlocked the door, but here they are working with this tool, you know. But anyway, that's just neither here nor there. This was what I see a lot. I see, if you notice, every window on this vehicle except for the driver's window is taped up. Now, he probably had the money to get this one fixed, but he didn't want to spend what it took to fix these other ones, and he didn't want them falling down or you know, coming open while it was going to rain and all that kind of stuff. But I don't know how many times I've seen people tape their car windows up like this. And like I say, that's the only one he didn't tape up. And so, if he doesn't ride in these other places, he probably don't care if those windows work or not. I saw this one at the grocery store one day. Always looking for stuff like this. Here's another one I thought was really interesting. This guy right here is an original thinker. He got some truck mirror, and there was another truck mirror on the other side just exactly like this I saw later. Now, this is a Corolla, and this guy gonna have him some mirrors now. Now he does have to pay attention to how close he parks to another car. He can run those mirrors out and in. Those are the ones that on those telescoping arms and all that kind of stuff. And I thought that was really good. He can definitely see everything that's going on behind him. Some of the stuff that people do is so original in their thinking, you know. You can tell this guy right here is a sort of a do-it-yourself kind of guy, you know. He thinks outside the box. My dad was like that. My dad always thought outside the box. There's a bunch of spark plug photos. You see it. You see little charts like this all over the place. These are photos I took myself. This one here is wore out plug. This one here is that wore out plug I've showed you a time or two. It's got 238,000 miles on the original plug in an Explorer. This one here, if you see one that's wet like this, it's either wet because it's not firing or it's not firing because it's wet. If you understand what I mean. I've actually seen some of them that you'll pull them out and they'll be wet like this, and that's not the reason they're not firing. Because some of the students would pull one out, they see it was wet, they screw another plug in there and it would still be misfiring, and it would get the new plug wet. Of course, if the plug's wet for some other reason, you know, like if it's pumping so much oil into the cylinder that it's totally wet the plug, and you know, whenever it's wet, the spark's not going to jump that gap, it's going to follow the wetness, you know, that's what it's going to do. This is running too rich, way too rich. You got to find out where that fuel is coming from. Is it being commanded to go in there by the PCM because of a map sensor hose that's disconnected or whatever, or is it going in from somewhere the PCM is not commanding, like a ruptured fuel pressure regulator, or maybe going in through the canister purge or something like that. Valve stem seals, right there. That's valve stem seal deposits. This is a bridged gap. Sometimes, even though you'll have a new plug, there'll be some little something, and it's almost miraculous, that will bridge that gap, even on a plug that doesn't look this rough. And when that gap is bridged, there's no naked spark, it just runs through. And my neighbor's lawnmower did that. She had a no-start on her lawnmower. First time I went over there to fix her no-start on her little lawnmower, it just wouldn't start. And I took the breather off, soaked a paper towel in some gasoline, stuck it there, fires up. She had a carburetor issue. You can't rebuild a carburetor on a stupid lawnmower. So I went and got another carburetor put on there, fired up, first pull, she's great, she mowed her grass. The next week, she goes out there, wouldn't start. Hey, I'm a no start again. So I figured, well, is it gas again? No, it wasn't gas that time. Pulled the plug out, and it was a really nice, crisp looking little spark plug, but there was some little something that was bridging it. And it seems like that air going through there would blow it out of there. But whenever you reach over your screwdriver, it's kind of tough to break it out of there. And it would just look like a little stick or a piece of wire, it wasn't any thicker than a human hair. I don't know what that was, but I've seen that on vehicles too. And I saw it on her lawnmower. You pull it out and look at it, you're going to see that. You say, well, that's why it won't start. Broke that out of there, screwed the plug back in, first start. This right here is what happened. You see that dusty red stuff? That's the octane booster. First time I saw that was my brother's 71 Thunderbird. They started cutting up and misfiring, and I took the plugs out and they had this rusty looking stuff on there. What the heck is this? These plugs are nearly new. And he'd been using octane booster because he had that 429, you know, that 350 horsepower 429 or whatever it was in that bird. And he was pouring octane booster in it because he thought it needed it. And I've seen this on cars that were nearly new. Somebody pour octane booster in there. And I'm not saying every octane booster does this, but notice how this all this carbon tracking is going on. How it starts. This is a conductive dust, and I don't know why that octane booster puts it on there, but it does. A plug like this, sometimes it happens because it gets too hot. It happens because a piece of carbon hits it and cracks the ceramic. There's a bunch of different reasons it'll do this. This had a little valve stem seal deposit too. Alright, this one right here, Champion spark plug, came with no threads. Outstanding performance. I wonder what their quality control people, you know, how they let that get past. Now these plugs here, this girl brought me her these two plugs, and she said her brother had one of them Ford trucks that's got dual plugs on it. It was a 4-cylinder with 8 plugs, 2 plugs per cylinder. And both of these plugs were from all the rest of the plugs look good. And both of these plugs came from the same cylinder, and he had changed out all the spark plugs and found the 2 in this one cylinder looking like this. And then about a week later, The new plugs he put in started looking like this. I'm talking about scorched, burn, looked like he hit them with a torch. And I had seen this before at the dealership. And I told her, I says, what he's going to need to do is if he checks the compression, he'll probably find the compression a little lower on that cylinder than the other ones. And he's got leaking intake valve. And it's pulling air in there and making that cylinder run blistering hot and burning up those plugs. And we had a 5.8 in a Ford F-150 over there. The guy that was working in the next service bay over there that was doing drivability work said that he said this thing has burned this plug up. So he put another plug in it. You just without even thinking about why. Come back a week later, burned up the same way. He measured the compression at 150 or 60 on all the other cylinders, but that one had 125. I said, you're gonna have that thing needs a valve job. And that cylinder's been running super hot. So he goes to the line mechanics over there, and the guy pulls the heads off, find, oh yeah, I did a valve job on it, yeah, I got a leaking intake valve. Puts it all back together. It's still skipping on number 5. And so they're working on that, trying to figure out why it's still skipping on number 5. And so, totally out of context, I didn't even know this was the same truck. The guy that was working on it, the line mechanic from the other side of the shop, said the shop foreman wants you to test this injector, which it was the number 5 injector. And so I took hooked a couple of wires to it and sprayed some spray through it, and I said, well, it energizes and it's letting fuel through. I don't know, you can't look at it and actually tell anything. Well, the shop foreman had the idea that he wanted me to connect it to the injector cleaning machine that had these little floating balls in there. I'd already found out that would lie to you. Seems like that flow check would be a really good test, but I don't know how many times I had used that to try to determine which injectors were on these Ford cars, to try to figure which injectors were clogged. You could never tell. You cleaned the injectors, it ran better, and you didn't get any information from that, so I didn't use that. Well, he put it all back in there, and believe it or not, the shop foreman told him to put a motor in it. So he put a motor in it, and it still skipped on cylinder number 5. I mean, this was a used car department. It wasn't a customer, but the used car department put a motor in the truck. And so he brought it over, and he goes, well, this thing's still skipping on number 5. And I didn't know it was the same truck. I mean, the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. So I cleaned the injectors on it, using the machine and the chemical and all, and it cleared it up. And boy, that shop foreman got hot about that. He said, I wanted you to test this injector. And I said, well, I did test the injector, but that machine lies to you. It's not even telling you the truth anyway. Even if I'd hooked it to that machine, I still wouldn't have been able to tell you any different. Anyway, he was pretty irritated about that. Of course, the person that bought that truck from the used car department got a new truck with a new engine in it. And that ran really good after I cleaned the injectors. Anyway, that was a long story. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, this Crown Vicky here. I'm gonna hold that rag so you can see what it's doing. See that? That's an irregular misfire. That means that somebody didn't gap the spark plugs, or one of them has got a gap that's bent a little too close. And we're going to find out which one it is.
Okay, this looks pretty doggone good, and I don't really see a lot wrong with that. The gap was a little bit close until you turn it over, and that does that. So that was our poo skipping. We knew there was something wrong with the spark plug. Usually it means the gap is bent shut, but in this case it was set up. I don't know how you would do that even if you wanted to.
That's what it's supposed to sound like right there. Real smooth, no puff, puff, puff.
One of the earliest things I learned when I was fixing cars so they'd run right, is that if you have a random misfire like that, like you were seeing in the early part of that video, it's usually because somebody has gapped the spark plugs too close. And my buddy Donnie had just come to work at the Ford place from Lincoln Mercury, and he had years of experience. And some of these Ford vehicles would have you gapping the plugs a little bit too close. And on these vans, which they call 42 to 46 to right gap, and I would gap them at 50. I would always, if it was calling for that, of course a lot of them GM cars wanted 80 thousandths, but if it was calling for, 40 some odd thousandths of an inch, I'd gap them to 50 thousandths every time. And I told him, I said, you need to gap them spark plug to 50 instead of 42 to 46. He goes, I'm going to go by what this sticker says. I said, okay, that's fine. You just do whatever you feel like you need to do, but you're going to be pulling it back out of there. And so whenever he put all them plugs in there, gapped at 42 or 44 or whatever he gapped them at, he was getting a random idle miss, just like this. And so he had to pull all them plugs back out of there and gap them out to 50, and then he had a smooth idle. Also, if it's partially fouled, you'll have that. Or, you know, if there's something wrong with one of the plugs, kind of like you're seeing here. But if you hear a random idle miss like that, one of the plugs is either partially fouled, gapped a little bit too close, something like that. Particularly if you didn't have a random idle miss before somebody put plugs in it and it developed one after that, it's going to be, unless you've got a power balance thing going on with your you know, scan tool or whatever, you're going to have to pull the plugs out and just gap them all a little wider than it calls for. If you gap them a little wider, it ain't hurting the doggone thing. It's actually making the spark hotter. Now, I will tell you, if you're doing race car stuff, like if you're tacking that thing up to 12,000 RPM, you're going to want a closer gap, so that burn time will be longer. But it's going to be hard to start with a closer gap, and it's not going to idle good. So there's a, you know, there's the trade-off there. You got to figure that out. Some mechanics would that were really sticklers for this back in the day would use little extra washers under the plugs, and they'd mark the direction that the ground electrode was pointing, and they want to tighten the plug up and stop it so that it was pointing right at the intake valve. You know, that was something that I learned from my filling station days back in the mid-70s. Now, this is a tool right here that just on a whim, I created this tool so that I could disconnect the fuel pump center of the tank. Now, that was the when you buy a new replacement fuel pump for one of them GMCs like I built this for, it's going to be a wide flat connector because you had to change it out when you change the pump. But I built this one here so I could demonstrate to the guys on that trainer truck. It's got a potentiometer in here, and this looks like a 50 ohm potentiometer, not 50,000, 50 ohms, or you know, whatever. And then I would it needs to be pretty much equal to whatever your sender is going to be. And it's got long wires on it. You plug that thing in. You can get in the dash, get in the truck and switch on the key, and you can turn that potentiometer to different settings and see if your gauge is responding, right? And so there, you know, you could, and you notice I got it hooked to just two of these right here. Let's see how this looks. See that? You insert the pot and you hook it to the middle one and one of the outside ones. It doesn't matter which outside one you hook it to. Now this is the way that GMC was. The PCM actually receives fuel level input, and then it would send information to the instrument cluster computer. This was in 1999. So think about how many years ago this was and how much electronics there was. You know, when years before that they just had the fuel sender hooked directly to the gauge. Anyway, this was a little tool that I made. It didn't cost hardly anything to build it. I did, you know, took an old pump and cut this out of it and all that kind of stuff and soldered all that together. I was always trying to come up with stuff like that. Sometimes it was something I used a lot. Sometimes I didn't use it very much, but I had fun building it. This was a picture that was sent to me by a guy a friend of mine that owned a tire store. And this thing had an induction backfire event. Backfired up in the intake and busted the aluminum intake manifold. This is not too hard to believe when you look at all the square inches in here. There's a lot of area in here. So it didn't take very much of an induction backfire pressure to destroy this thing. See, if it had a different shape or whatever. It wasn't very thick either. But induction backfire can happen because it's out of time. It can happen because, believe it or not, it can because of a lean condition in one cylinder. It can backfire into the intake, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. But this one here wound up having to have a manifold. The problem is, if it busts that manifold and you don't find out why it induction backfired, you're liable to bust another one. Now sometimes it'll be, you know, spark plugs crossed will do that. This is kind of a funny story. I took a spark plug on a Taurus trainer car. I was going to set some bug up for some of my drivability students, you know, and I swapped a couple of plug wires around on a coil pack on this 96 or 97 model Mercury Sable. I think it was a 3-liter. And I said, okay, let's see what that does. And when I spun it over, it kicked back and busted the starter. And the starter was hanging by the wires.
Got a little bit of a knocker here.
Now this catalytic converter, and I looked down in there with a borescope through the oxygen sensor hole, that was on this car, right down in there, and that's what destroyed this thing. All right, imagine what would happen if somebody said, well, this thing's knocking, but we don't know why, so we're just going to go ahead and throw a motor in it. Put a motor in it without just looking at that catalytic converter on an Altima, you're on borrowed time, because if that new motor starts knocking, or the replacements, you're in big trouble. We not only had to replace the motor in this, we need to replace the catalytic converter. If you don't find out what caused the problem to begin with, it's going to come back on you. And I don't know how many times I've seen that, and I don't know how many times I've had to teach people that. You know, I was explaining, you know, somebody comes in here with a car that's overheating because of an intermittent cooling fan, and you fix whatever was messed up, you know, blown gasket or whatever, because it was overheating, without fixing the cooling fan, because it seems to be okay. You better test it with that test light method I taught. That cooling fan fails to come on and it overheats again, it's on you. You know, but a lot of the times, you know, anyway, I'm not going to get into all that. I've been here 35 minutes. This was longer than I intended to be. Some of the guys have probably dropped out about 20 minutes ago. But here we go. This is the end of this video, and I'll see you guys next week. I really appreciate you tuning in. Share the video with friends, and let me know what you think about it. I'll talk to you next Monday.